Hi, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Welcome from all around the world. We are really delighted and thrilled to have you here with us tonight. My name is Ori Barnett. I'm the Educational Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. And tonight I'd like to introduce our guest lecturer, Sarah Levy from Yad Vashem, for her lecture called Representing the Holocaust, Yad Vashem's Journey of Memory and Education. I'll start by welcoming Sarah by sharing with you her biography. Sarah was born in London and moved to Israel 25 years ago with her family. She has 30 years of experience in both formal and informal education, in studies, English, and in Holocaust history. From 2018 until 2023, Sarah was the program coordinator for the very well-known and highly regarded Echoes and Reflections Holocaust Educational Program, aimed at American teachers, run by Yad Vashem, and it was then that I had the privilege of getting to know Sarah. And Sarah now runs programs and seminars for United States campus faculties. She heads the South African and New Zealand desks at the Overseas Education and Training Department at Yad Vashem Holocaust History Museum, where she is also a licensed guide. The Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and in fact the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation in general, has had the pleasure of working with Sarah over a number of years, where she has visited our centers across South Africa. She has run workshops for our staff and volunteers, and she has enriched many audiences through public events. We are honored, Sarah, to have you here tonight to share with us your work and your insights over many, many years, and to include us in the goings-on of Yad Vashem in Israel. And it is a special honor this month because we are currently commemorating 80 years since the liberation of many camps. And this is also the story of many of our survivors here in South Africa who are reflecting on the last 80 years of their freedom, but also 80 years of rebuilding their lives. So with that in mind, I'd like to hand over to Sarah, and after the lecture, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. If you do have a question for Sarah, please feel free to leave a comment or question in the Q&A box or in the chat. And also please feel free to share in the chat where you are joining us from. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Orly. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. It's really my pleasure to be with you and to explore this subject together. I have quite a bit of material to get through, so I'll jump straight in and hopefully make sure we get to cover everything and leave some time for questions at the end. The Holocaust was a transnational genocide of European Jewry, and it finally ended when the Allied forces moved across the continent and ousted the Nazi occupation, thereby liberating those who had somehow managed to survive the atrocities. Some 3.5 million European Jews had miraculously managed to stay alive. With the murder of 6 million others in a genocide of unimaginable proportions, we think about how this memory, how this event could be more memorialized. And interestingly enough, it didn't begin at the end of the war, this concept of memorializing this event. There was a man by the name of Mordechai Shenhabi, a Ukrainian Jew, who in 1919, he got on a boat from Odessa to reach Eretz Israel into Jaffa, where he settled and lived there. And he is very concerned about these rumors that are coming out, these very difficult stories that are coming out from Europe. And he is determined to form some kind of memory for this place. And he is speaking for this event, rather. He is speaking to all the local community leaders there in British-mandated Palestine. He is drawing up plans of buildings which he envisions, which will create this memory for this event. And he's sending letters and having discussions. And during this time, I just want to read a small excerpt of something that he said, just to give us, to shine a light on exactly his thoughts at the time. He says, this building, this place of memory, should be monumental. It should express the enormity of the Holocaust that we have suffered and give everlasting evidence of our people's will to live. So for him, it was twofold. To, of course, remember this unbelievable, unprecedented genocide, but also to speak about the people inside, the ones that their decision, their will, their desire to live. And what's interesting is to note, as I've highlighted below, he was asking for this memory. He was seeking people to assist him in creating this memory for this event in the fall and winter of 1942. Now, as we all know, the event hadn't finished yet. At the beginning of 1942, 80% of European Jewry was still alive. By the end of 1942, 80% of European Jewry had already been murdered. And there are things changing all the time. Of course, the event hasn't finished at all. There's still to come the incredible tragedy and devastation of the murder of the Hungarian Jews in the spring of 1944. So the people around him were not as keen as he was to start marking this event at that time. They told him, we're still in the middle of it. We don't know how far this will go. We don't know what the ends will be. And they made him wait. And nobody was really too forthcoming in assisting him on this dream of his. And it took 11 years, actually, until this commission, this Yad Vashem commission was set up. I'll explain about the name in the next slide. But for now, in 1953, a law is passed in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, which is establishing this remembrance authority in Jerusalem, this authority of Yad Vashem. And it was to commemorate the 6 million members of the Jewish people who died a martyr's death at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. There were other groups as well within this law. In other clauses, it speaks about the fighters, and also to remember, of course, the most precious righteous among the nations, those upstanding people, those non-Jews who stood up against the evil to try and change the course of where this evil was headed. And the name Yad Vashem actually comes from a verse in the book of Isaiah, from the Bible. And the context of this verse comes when God, through Moses, is making promises to the children of Israel and promising some future legacy, this eternal legacy that he will give to them, this covenant between them. And there are two groups of people amongst the children of Israel at the time who are concerned. And they voice their concerns to Moses, saying that they will not, they fear that they will not be included in this group of people who will be through whom the legacy will fall. And one of them is a group of converts. They were not born Jewish. They took Judaism upon themselves a little later in life. And the second group are people who didn't have children. And both of them were worried that perhaps they didn't, that it wouldn't go through them. But God reassures them through Moses. And in this verse, he says, tell them, I will give them, those people who are concerned, I will give them in my house and in my walls, a place and a name. The Hebrew is Yad Vashem. Yad is actually a hand in Hebrew, but in this context, it's we see it to mean an upright memorial, some kind of standing, a place of memory. And this will be better than sons and daughters. Tell them not to worry if they don't have children or if they weren't born Jewish. This will be an everlasting name. I will give him to each one. It's using the singular context, which will not be discontinued. So thus the name was born, and it began very modestly. Here we have the very first building where this establishment set up in the Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, building number 7. And there's a huge committee of people who are working feverishly to somehow create a memory of the Holocaust. Now, interestingly enough, most of these people are actually Holocaust survivors themselves. You can see in the bottom corner, this is Rachel Aubach, one of only 3 surviving members of the group of 60 members of the Oyneg Shabbos archives. This was set up by the Jewish Polish historian Emanuel Ringenblum in the Warsaw Ghetto, where this group of 60 members of the intelligentsia inside the ghetto, they gathered together completely, risking their lives in doing so. It was this work was forbidden, and collecting documentation of what their life was like in the Warsaw Ghetto. And together they collect approximately 30,000 pieces of diaries and artwork and music and posters and candy wrappers and all different forms of memories of this place. And so she is one of those last surviving members. She has a lot to offer. And many of the other people who are working on the staff are also Holocaust survivors themselves. Now, on the one hand, this is amazing because they are obviously so entrenched in this event, which had just finished a few years earlier. And they are very keen to bring their story to life, to try and find as many of the names that were lost as possible. And you can see in the top left corner, there's a gentleman there who's filling out pages of testimony. These are Dapei Ed in Hebrew that Yad Vashem we now have about 4.9 million of the names of the 6 million. And it was very important to these survivors to make sure that their stories were told, and also that their loved ones who had been murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators were remembered too. So it had a very certain perspective, this very first place of Yad Vashem. And one of the main movers and shakers in this group of people was a man called Professor Ben Zion Dinor. He himself was not a survivor, although he did come from Europe. He is a historian. He's also a member of parliament, a politician. He moved to Israel in 1921, what was British-mandated Palestine at the time. And it says, as you can see here, if we wish to live and to bequeath life to our offspring, if we believe that we are to pave the way to the future, then we must first of all not forget. So he also sees this as a two-pronged event, just like Mordechai Shenhabi did earlier, that we need to remember the past, but this also has to be a legacy for the future. We must make sure that our children don't forget what happened. This concept of memory is actually very prevalent in Jewish culture. There are many things that Jewish people are commanded to remember, one of which, for example, is the Exodus from Egypt, which in daily prayers every single day, we are now maybe 2,000 years after the event, and we are still commemorating this event. The Sabbath candles, the Shabbat candles that many Jewish women light, often two. One is for keeping the Sabbath, and the second one is to remember the Sabbath. This concept of memory is very prevalent, as I said. So what was the first museum? Once they moved out of those modest rooms that they had in Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, this new structure is built in 1957. And the architects of this building are Aryeh Elchanani. He hails from the Ukraine. He himself moved to British-mandated Palestine in 1922. And also Aryeh Sharon, who originated from Poland and moved to British-mandated Palestine in 1920. And you can see here the original museum. It's sort of it doesn't have any structural significance. It's a large oblong building. Just across the way, as my cursor is showing you here, is the very first memorial outside of the museum. I'll come to that a little bit later, but you can see it sits atop this mountain, which is now called the Mountain of Remembrance, on the western slope of Mount Herzl, which is a height in western Jerusalem, and it's now renamed the Mountain of Remembrance. And what's inside? It's essentially a history, a lesson in history. There is no pre-war Jewish life here. There is no discussion of life afterwards, of what the survivors did afterwards, which is interesting since the survivors themselves were the ones to build this story and build what this would look like. And what's interesting is that they didn't actually agree among each other. There were lots of discussions and people not agreeing of how this looked, because everybody was coming with their personal story. And this is probably a good place for me to mention as educators or anybody who is using survivor testimony. It's important for us to understand the value of this. And on the one hand, it is this exquisite and incredibly critical piece of teaching about the Holocaust that we hear from the mouths of the people who went through it themselves. But we also, when we use it, we have to place it in context. We have to understand that if we're reading the diary of a teenage girl who's in hiding in Amsterdam, she may probably not have much knowledge of what is happening in Poland or the Ukraine or Belarus at the same time. So while her testimony is incredibly important to us and we must use it, it's also very much important for us to take a step back and see it in the context and concerning the other events that were going on across Europe. So this museum, although very historical, it doesn't branch out too much on, and interesting enough, it doesn't have much testimony in this museum, which is also interesting, but we'll come to that perhaps a little bit later. In addition to this museum, which has been in this whole commission of Yad Vashem, 2 years later, another law is passed in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, which is called the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day Law. And this, as we know, we're marking tomorrow night and on Thursday itself, Yom HaShoah, the day of the Holocaust, which is a very solemn day in Israeli society. And the day, after much discussion, the day that was chosen is in fact the Hebrew date of the 27th of Nisan, which, as you can see in the bottom paragraph there, it falls a week after the Passover festival and 8 days before Israel's Independence Day. And why this was chosen was it marks, in fact, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which on April the 19th, 1943, was the first night of Passover when the Germans moved in to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was chosen because it was a sign of when the Jews were using their own agency, that they weren't passively being liberated from somewhere. It was a time, and there were thousands of other examples where the Jewish victims were trying to stand up and have some say in what was happening, to take some agency for themselves. And that's why this date was chosen. And on this day, as we will have tomorrow night at Yad Vashem, we have some incredibly beautiful and heartbreaking ceremonies. We have Holocaust survivors, of course. In not too many years, we will not have the privilege and honor of having them, as this community sadly dwindles as the years go by. There are many dignitaries and important people standing there giving, and there's always a theme as well that we have. And the following day is also a long day of memorial at Yad Vashem, where there's a lot of wreath laying from different communities across the world that come to pay their respects. What's interesting, though, is to contrast this day of memory that we have in Israeli society with the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance, which was established in 2005 by the United Nations. And the day that was designated for this, as we all know, is January the 27th, when Auschwitz was liberated. And it's amazing that it exists, and many countries across the world mark this day. But what's interesting to note is this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is a day on which the Jews were liberated. They were passively saved. And while, of course, this is a huge part of the story where we must always speak about the liberators coming in Israel, they prefer to remember this day as when the Jews took their own agency on themselves, and to mark the day on a day which remembered when they themselves tried to fight back. And going to the memorials now, in total, we have 42 more memorials on our 45-acre campus, but I'm just going to choose 5, which I'll briefly go through. And I've picked one from every decade. They're not in order. There are many memorials that came in between them. But just to give you a taste of how the memory changed and developed in Israeli society and how that was taken upon at Yad Vashem. So as I showed you earlier, the very first memorial is called Ohel Yizkor, the Hall of Remembrance. And it may be familiar to you because we have many very official ceremonies take place in this hallway, hall. And it was designed by the Ariel El-Hanani, who also had created, along with Ari Sharon, the first museum. And as you look at the outside, again, it's not it doesn't bear much significance, the building. It's sort of a clumsy, the roof is overhanging a little bit. But what's interesting is to note the stone at the bottom, the basalt rocks, which is a fiery stone. And we have this huge metal doorway. I'm not sure if you can see where my cursor is, which on it has broken branches, broken spears, which portrays and evokes this feeling of a broken battlefield. And if we go inside, you can see this rather somber and dark place. There's a sense of an air of holiness about it. And again, it's rather nondescript and it's very anonymous. There are no names here. We have this sloping roof. Some people say it reminds them of a gas chamber. Some people say it reminds them of a temple and synagogue. And it's a place of reflection and perhaps meditation. And on the floor, the only signs that we have of names of the places are actually 22 place names of sites of murder where Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And perhaps you can make some of these out. If you can see in the left side, there's Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Lvov, Yanovska, and at the front in Hebrew it says Bergen-Belsen, and there are some others too. And we could ask today in 2025, what about all the others? Today we know there were in fact 44,000 sites of murder. If we include or places where Jews were incarcerated during these years, that includes the ghettos, the concentration camps, the labor camps, the transit camps, and of course the death camps. And therefore we ask the question, why only 22? Well, of course, this is 1957. And not a whole lot has been uncovered. Nobody is talking right now. We'll speak about that later. The survivors are not bearing witness. They are not giving testimony. Again, I'll come to that later. And not many archives have been uncovered. The Oyneg Shabbos archives were uncovered in 1946 and 48, soon after the war. To the extent that they were analyzed by this time, I'm not sure how much it was in the public view at this point. But if we skip ahead a decade to 1968, and we see a very different memorial. This is called the Pillar of Heroism. It was designed by Moshe Schwartz. His nickname was Bookie Schwartz. And he, in fact, was born in Israel. This is the first Israeli architect now who's designing memorials. And what we see here is very different. It's a very tall, proud, strong structure. It's actually the tallest one in Israel, the tallest memorial site in Israel, reaching up to the skies. There's something quite majestic about it. And if we look at the inscription close up, you can see that it's really, this is designated to those heroic and courageous fighters, the Jews who fought back, the soldiers in the armies, and all those who tried to save these people. And it has a very different feel to it. Now, this piece was deeply influenced by two major events which occurred in Israeli society in the 1960s. I'm sure many of you have guessed these already, but the first, of course, was the Eichmann trial in 1960 and 1961, where Adolf Eichmann, who was a chief architect of the Holocaust, who was personally responsible for sending around 1 million Jews to their deaths, he is kidnapped by the Mossad, the Israeli secret police, and brought to Israel for a fair and just trial. He is placed behind a glass enclosure. He is protected by Israeli soldiers. And please note that these are Israeli guards, rather not soldiers, these Israeli guards, policemen, were specifically chosen from the Sephardic community in Israel, because it was presumed it was too difficult for Ashkenazi Israeli Jews to be guarding this man, because they had so much personal connection to this terrible story. So for his own safety and for his own protection, he was given Sephardi guards to protect him. Now, who are the witnesses in this very long case? It took many months. Well, of course, they are the survivors. And this is now 15 years after the end of the Holocaust. And sadly, this is actually the very first time where there is a public platform for these survivors to present their testimony, to share their experiences. Why had they not shared them beforehand? Well, for many reasons. First of all, it was perhaps too difficult for them to express it. Maybe they hadn't come to terms with the enormous loss in the early years. They didn't have the vocabulary, perhaps. But more than that, shockingly and very sadly, Israeli society was not willing to listen to these testimonies. There was this kind of air of suspicion. There was an air of blame. Why did you let this happen to you? Why did you go, in inverted commas, like sheep to the slaughter? Israeli Jews at that time regarded Eastern European Jews especially as perhaps bookish with their head in their books in the study halls of the yeshivas. And there was kind of a, we don't want to really hear about it. Another fact was that they were actually fighting off lots of neighboring enemies at the time, and they were too busy in 1948 and 1956 fighting off wars, and these survivors had to pull up their sleeves, a tattoo from Auschwitz or no tattoo on their arms, and they had to literally get stuck in and help. And sadly, many of these survivors, who were the last remaining members of their families, were actually killed during the War of Independence. Now, the second event that influenced this particular structure was the Six-Day War in 1967. And in less than a week, this tiny fledgling state managed to ward off 5 hostile neighbors in this very quick war, which had very much a David and Goliath feel to it, where this tiny, spunky, feisty country was able, with very minimal and limited means, actually, to manage to somehow ward it off. And therefore, this concept of courage and bravery was very prevalent in Israeli society at that time. If we move forward another decade, I want to show you the accompaniment that Nathan Rappaport placed, that he created in 1976 to go with his original monument called Uprising, which features in Warsaw, actually, and a replica was made in Yad Vashem. This obviously reminds us of memorializes the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We see here Mordechai Nilevich in the center, but I haven't got time to really go into that now. I want to just move to the 1970s. And we see this sculpture in bas relief created, as I said, by Nathan Rappaport in 1976. And this depicts a very big shift in Holocaust education and memory. Now, if you can see with my cursor in the background, we see the helmets of these German perpetrators. Okay, in the very first museum from 1957, which I didn't mention earlier, much of the photography was taken from the perpetrator's perspective, because not many of the archives had been uncovered at that point. But we're moving to a shift now where we want to focus on the victims themselves. What is the Jewish story? So we don't see their faces. We know that they're in the background. They're in this black shadow in the background. And here we see the faces of these people. Now, on first glance, this looks like a very sad sight. We imagine, as by the name of this piece, The Last March, that these people are being deported to their deaths or to forced labor, presumably because they appear elderly, and if there are women and children here, we would assume they're being deported to their deaths. But what we want to now depict and see inside this is the details. If you notice this woman who's clutching her pregnant belly, she's clutching her unborn baby. Now, in many places across Nazi-occupied Europe, it was forbidden for Jewish women to have children. We also see this man, this religious-looking man, perhaps he's a rabbi, we don't know, clutching onto the Torah scroll. Again, in many places across Europe, it was forbidden to study the Torah. We also see another sign here of what appears to be an elderly lady holding on to the hand of a young child. And these little depictions are what the late Professor Yehuda Bauer called in the 1970s Amidah, this Hebrew word which means standing, which literally means resistance, this spiritual resistance. I actually like to call it insistence, that in spite of everything going on around, in spite of this overhanging shadow of utter misery and persecution, these people still wanted to maintain their values and ethics and their identities of who they were before. And this, as I said, this 1970s bring us into a different shift. Who were these people? What was their story? And how do we relate to this story afterwards? Jumping ahead now to the next decade in the 1980s, we come to the Children's Memorial created by Moshe Safdie. He's an Israeli-Canadian architect, and he is approached in 1987 by a couple called Edita and Avraham Spiegel, and they ask if they can help donate money for a memorial in memory of their little boy Uziel. You can see him, I've just enlarged this area, you can see him embossed in the wall over here, of their 2-year-old son Uziel, who was taken to the gas chambers in Auschwitz and murdered at the age of 2, along with his grandmother. And Yad Vashem welcomed this initiative. They've been waiting for some time for it, and they provide this memorial not just for Uziel Spiegel, but for the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered in the Holocaust. If we go inside this memorial, it's a very different feel. This is very experiential. There are tiny dots of light all over, which try to symbolize the 1.5 million spots of light which were extinguished, these beautiful young children. And I'm going to play for you now, I hope it works, just a recording of what we would hear inside this memorial.
Immanuel Yakovetsky, 5 years old, Ukraine. Paula Kolin, 12 years old, Poland. Anna Rivka Yosefovich, 5 years old.
Okay, so as we can see, there are 3 things which we hear in this memorial. In the actual memorial in Yad Vashem, we hear it in 3 languages, these names, Hebrew and Yiddish and English. So what are the 3 things that we heard in this memorial? The child's name, the place where they were born, and also their age. All these new facts are coming out. These are not just numbers. These are not anonymous people, as we saw in the very first memorial. We have the names of these people. This is sweet little Uziel Spiegel. This is the last photo that was ever taken of him. And this is what we are remembering, the specifics, who the people were. And if I jump ahead to the last memorial that I want to show you, into the 1990s, also created this piece by Moshe Safdie. This cattle car, as you're all familiar with, was actually found in a storage unit in Poland, and it was donated by the Polish government to Yad Vashem. It was restored. Of course, it didn't look like this. And there's almost 100% certainty that this cattle car itself was one of those that deported thousands and thousands of Jews to their deaths in various camps. Unlike other Holocaust memorials across the world, visitors are not allowed to go inside this cattle car, because at Yad Vashem, it's very important to us that we don't role play ever, that we never believe that we can understand what it was like for these people. Stepping onto a cattle car would not help us to understand anymore exactly what these people went through. So what we do is we use the voices of the people who did go through it in order to understand. I'm going to play you again another piece. It's 2-3 minutes. It's very grainy. I apologize in advance, and the sound isn't perfect, but you'll be watching the subtitles because the survivor here, Kalman Perk, he speaks in Hebrew. But please read the subtitles and listen to his incredible story.
שהרוסים כבר היו הגרמנים את שארית הגטו. הביאו אותנו לתחנת הרכבת, שזה היה בקרבים של העיר. אינני יודע כמה היו בתוך 50 אולי 100. כולם ידעו שהנסיעה הזו זה למחנות ההשמדה, זה לא היה ספק. אני יכול להעיד שלא הייתה שום היסטריה. זאת אומרת, למרות כל המקום החנוק הזה, עכשיו אני אפילו מרגיש את הריח, ובכל זאת אנשים שומרים על צלם עיניו. הרכבת התחילה לזוז, ופה קרה דבר מפתיע. אחד האנשים רץ לאשנב, ובכוח בלתי רגיל, פרע את חוטי התיל מהאשנב הזה, וניסה לדחוף את עצמו ולא יכול היה. הייתי עוד בגיל 14 מאוד רזה, כמו רוב האנשים במחנה הגטו, ואם הגיע מישהו שישאר בפגים, ויעתה, אבי אמר, והוא בדרך המחושבת שלו קם ומרים אותי, ולא רק זה, והיא אומר לי, אני אוציא אותך עם הרגליים, תוציא את הרגליים, מה איתך את הרגליים? ואני זוכר את התנועה הזאת, כי התנועה הזאת ממש בנפשי, סיבבתי את ראשי ורציתי עוד חיבוק, עוד משהו, פרידה נוראית, כל מי שאהבתי הולך למחנות ההשמדה. במקום זה בצורה מאוד רגועה, כנראה שהוא רצה להקרין בי שקט נפשי. הוא אמר לי, du sollst sein ein Mensch. ודחף אותי החוצה. את אמי לקחו לשתות טוב המשרפות, ובאותו היום גם את סבי והסבתא וכל המשפחה נרצחו, והאוויר בנחל עם אותו גובל. הציווי הזה של אבי, שיהיה בן אדם, או זה ממנץ', תמצאת לי את מלאך החיים, וזה לא חשוב שאני אהיה פרופסור, מה שנפחתי, או סמלן, או שאני אהיה בן אדם. ואני רק מקווה שעד לרגע האחרון הוא הרגיש וידע שנשארתי והולך בציווי הזה.
That's the story of Kalman Perk, an incredible human being who did become a professor of veterinary science. He contributed an enormous amount to the medical field. And this precept of his father's, which he says in Yiddish, Kalman, du sollst sein ein Mensch, that you should be a human being, is now the message that we take with us from the 90s and onwards. This was a human story, a story of humanity, that a group of humans committed against another group of human beings, and a third group of human beings stood by and allowed it to happen, and a fourth group of human beings stood up, these righteous among the nations, and made very different choices. So now with all this information that we have, how, again, I'm going to ask the same question. How do we memorialize this unprecedented event? We understand now that there are many messages that we have to be learned from this event. In 1982, the Israeli Ministry of Education, Culture and Sport mandate Holocaust education in schools. 11th and 12th grade students have to learn 30 hours at least of Holocaust education. And even children in kindergarten are exposed to basic Holocaust education by necessity. Why do I say by necessity? Because as we will be having on Thursday morning, there is a 2-minute siren siren that sounds across the country. And it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the grocery store, whether you're in the dentist chair, or whether you're a little child in kindergarten, you will stop for 2 minutes in order to respect the memory of these 6 million victims. And therefore, these children have to be explained as to what it is that we're doing. And they're used obviously in very age-appropriate manner, and very soft and gentle words are used, nothing too traumatic. But it's then in 1982 that it's implemented by law in the education system. And in response to that, the school actually where I work at Yad Vashem, the International School for Holocaust Studies, was built in 1993. And it's actually now called the International Institute for Holocaust Education, literally just changed a few weeks ago. We have 17 classrooms, a pedagogical center, and over 350,000 people pass through our corridors and classrooms to learn about the Holocaust and the messages. And therefore, as a result of all of these changes, the second museum is built in 2005, created by architect Moshe Safdie. We saw him before. He was one who designed many of the memorials at Yad Vashem. And we see here on this amazing aerial photo, the original museum is here, and that first memorial, the Hall of Remembrance, is over here. But this new museum cuts through the mountain of remembrance. And the reason for this is it's deemed to be a scar, an eternal scar inside Jewish history and in the Jewish present and in the Jewish future. As the Holocaust survivor Aaron Appelfeld said, he was also a novelist and a writer, he said that it's a biological wound. And the Holocaust is prevalent in all aspects of Israeli society, in culture, in film, in literature, in music. It's very prevalent, not in a concept as victimhood, but as a part of our very strong history, as something that we carry along with us. We also never made up the numbers. There are approximately 17.5 million Jews in the world in 1939. Once 6 million were murdered from the hands of the Nazis and collaborators. And to this day, 80 years later, we are still approximately 15 million Jews in the world. We never reached the numbers. So we say this eternal scar, this biological wound, has remained with us ever since. The vision at Yad Vashem is always to document, research, educate, and commemorate about the Holocaust, and to convey the chronicles of this single Jewish and human event to everyone in Israel, to the Jewish people, and to all significant and relevant audiences worldwide. What I feel is very important as well is what Yad Vashem does as preserving the Jewish character within the universal context. I think recently there's been a tendency, and it's fair enough, for centers across the world to try and globalize this event, to try and bring in, and that's very important that we make sure that this event, the way we teach it, is available to everybody, and it's also taught in terms of what the context that they can understand. But we must never lose sight that the Holocaust, the Shoah itself, and I'm not talking about the Second World War, and of course there were 60 million victims of the Second World War, and all of their stories must be told. But this specific case at Yad Vashem about the Shoah is talking about the Jewish story that happened during the Second World War. This new museum has 9 galleries. I call it new. It's actually 20 years old already. It's state-of-the-art, much testimony. We hear lots of witness testimony, survivor testimony that we go through. We have adopted an educational philosophy here. I'll just run through it very quickly because we're short of time, that we must teach the Shoah as a story of mankind and human choices. This concept of choices, which a phrase coined by the historian Lawrence Langer, where we want to understand who the victims were. Who were they before the war? Who were they during the war? And for those who survived, who were they afterwards? What was available to them at the time of these horrors? What were the choices that they made even under this umbrella of horror? The fact that they chose to even choose, if that makes sense, is quite an incredible thing for us to analyze and explore. We teach this history through individual stories. We hone in on the individual. Like we saw in the Children's Memorial, each person has a story unto themselves. We present the victims in a threefold periodization, unlike the first museum, where we don't just speak about the persecution that happened inside. Who were these people before they became victims? Where were they from? What was their culture? What were they contributing to society? We present the victim only from their own self-perception. We don't project how we feel about what we think they may have experienced inside that cattle car. I want you to hear from Kalman Perk himself how he felt being in that cattle car, because I, thank God, didn't experience it. We also present the Shoah as a transnational catastrophe, And of course, we take all our students safely in and safely out. There's no place for trauma in this education. That's not the purpose of teaching it. And I won't go through all of this, but you can see the very impressive collection that we have at Yad Vashem, almost 200 million pages of documentation, almost 5 million of the names of the 6 million who were murdered, over 500,000 photographs, all the survivor testimonies, artifacts, artwork, films, books. And what do we do with all of this? Where do we put it all, and how do we make it available, and how do we teach it? So at Yad Vashem, we definitely teach about the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question. This is definitely spoken about, and the horrors that the perpetrators perpetrated against the Jews of Europe. But what we prefer to focus on as well is the Jewish response and the Jewish experience. Who were these people and what were they experiencing as they went through? So stories like Friedel Dicker Brandeis, this amazing woman who was born in Vienna. She moved to Prague in Czechoslovakia. She lived there with her husband. She was a phenomenal artist. She studied at the Bauhaus in Germany. As you can see, some of her beautiful works here, these stunning colors and incredible talents. These are painted as just before some of them just before the war, and you can see the bottom left was after war had broken out already, and this is her catharsis. But she sadly is deported to Terezin in 1943. And in 1942, and while she is there, she is put in charge of several hundred children who are in Terezin, and she teaches them how to create art, and she puts on these groups, these sessions of artwork. And one might think that the kind of artwork that these children would produce in the horrors of Terezin, there's no other word to describe. Terezin was one of the harshest places for people to exist. We would expect them perhaps to draw death or starvation or hunger, and yet these beautiful pictures, these are three of many, many examples. You can see little Anna Bekova is drawing a memory of home, and little Peter Holzbauer is just drawing a train passing through the countryside. And a stunning piece by Jindriska Habalova of an oasis by a swimming pool. Look at these magical colors that she's using. And what did Friedel Dicker Brandeis offer these children? As one of the very few students of hers that survived, Helga Pollack says, that she transported us to a different world. She painted flowers in windows, a view out of a window. She had a totally different approach. She didn't make us draw Terezin. She, in spite of all what was going on around her, she managed to provide some kind of emotional outlet for these children, for even those few short moments or minutes that they were drawing or painting, that they could escape their terrible reality. And here is another example. On face value, this is a page of testimony of a boy whose name was Avramek Kopelovich, who was murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. But at Yad Vashem, we don't just have this piece of paper. We want you to know who Avramek Kopelovich was, this sweet little boy who was born to his parents, Yohet Gittel, and his father Mendel, who was born in Lodz. They are they're forced into the ghetto in Lodz, where by the time he's a teenager, he's obviously, I don't know if any of you have teenage boys, but they get hungry very quickly. This is a teenage boy who is literally starving. And yet what he chooses to do, as you can see in this beautiful manuscript here, he decides to write. He is an exquisite poet, and he has this amazing poem called Marzeni, which means a dream in Poland. And this has been translated into English. If I had more time, I would read it for you. But you can glance over it, and I highly recommend that you look it up. This boy who was starving, literally starving to death, has witnessed all the horrors and traumas around him. He writes this stunning piece about his dreams and hopes for the future. And not only do we understand what kind of person he was and his sheer brilliance, many Polish poets have commented on this young boy's ability to write poetry and comment on how the genius of it. He speaks and shows us about his amazing education, the fact that he can name all these geographical locations, these places he'd like to visit on an airplane once he gets out of this cage, as he calls it. Now, I'm not sure if he actually believed he'd ever get out of this Lodz ghetto. He does, in fact, he's deported with his father to Auschwitz. But before he goes, he's also an artist. And you can see this beautiful example of his painting, which is called Prayer, which he has created inside the Lodz ghetto in 1943. He has been placed in there for many years. He is absolutely starving, and yet he managed to create this exquisite piece at the tender age of 13. Now, sadly, Avram Kopolovich does not survive, but his poetry and his artwork does, and it's our job at Yad Vashem to make sure that these are remembered. And in recent years, we have made many additions to the campus to bring this into modernity and to bring into the modern world, the education that we give and the memory. We can see, for example, last July, this collections, this magnificent state-of-the-art collections building, the David and Fella Chappelle building, where all of those, as you saw, those lists of amazing collection statistics that we have, they had been really in the bowels of the archives at Yad Vashem, and here we could bring them up and be able to put them on show and display them and make them more accessible to visitors. And it's also a place where they can be preserved. You can see this lady at the top hand corner, and therefore these pieces that belong to real people, to victims, can now be placed in a place of honor that we can view them. Another amazing new addition at Yad Vashem, which just opened a few weeks ago, is the Touching Memories Theatre. At the moment, we have 4 different plays. Of course, they are all based exactly on the primary sources of victims and survivors. They tell the stories of many of these in a beautiful way, in a very creative way. This adds another dimension to how we teach at Yad Vashem. And in just a couple of weeks, we're opening up an audio-visual experience in the Valley of the Communities, which tells the story, a 1,000-year history of Jewish life. Who were these people before they became victims of the Nazis and their collaborators? So all of this packaged up brings us to today's day, really. And of course, we were deeply impacted by the horrors of October the 7th, 2023, which shook the whole of Israel and the whole Jewish world up after these events, and made us now consider, what do we do with this new event, which is the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust? How do we deal with it? How do we incorporate it, if at all, into Holocaust education? Does it have a place? We see these horrific photos of grief and trauma. And it was only natural that after these events, that people within Israeli society and perhaps the Jewish world as a whole, and other people too, would start to make these analogies, would start to connect the Shoah, the Holocaust, to the events of October the 7th. And just for example, I've given you a few examples here. In the top left corner, we see the number 6,001,300. The 6 million part is obvious, referring to the victims of the Holocaust, and the 1,300 refer to those Israelis who were murdered on that terrible day itself. And of course, it's unavoidable that these connections would be made, but what do we do with it? We see here this poem by Israeli poet Noam Chorev, who says that every Jew is born with an invisible number tattooed on his arm, so he can never forget from where he came and to where he must never return. And as I say, these analogies and equations are made whether we want to or not. Even Holocaust survivors themselves who survived the horrors of October 7th. We had Holocaust survivors who were taken hostage too, who some sadly were murdered in captivity, and some were released and could come and tell the story. But many comparisons are being made between these two events. And what is it that we do? The shared language that we do, we have to be super careful, because we have to be careful in all historical events and in all things that go on in the world. We have to be intelligent enough to note the similarities and to also make a note of the differences. If we look at the similarities between these two events, of course, there was extreme evil meted out against innocent civilians. This was specifically, both of them were specifically anti-Jewish events. There were gleeful perpetrators and bystanders. I placed the word bystanders in inverted commas because at Yad Vashem, we do not believe that a person who is viewing something like this can be a bystander. This is a choice that they've made to stand by and watch. Both have violent and radical ideologies. And of course, there are attempts to deny and distort the events. And of course, we must also focus on the differences. The ideologies are not exactly the same. The Nazis wanted to rid the entire world of Jews. We could argue that perhaps Hamas wanted to just remove the Jews from Israel. The mass murder on October the 7th was documented in real time. The Nazis tended not to record the horrors. We know all the body cams and GoPros that the Hamas infiltrators had and broadcast that to the world as it was happening. There's also what we have today, very sophisticated and far-reaching means of propagating ideology. Joseph Goebbels' campaign of propaganda in the Holocaust is of course very well known, where he managed to infiltrate every aspect of German life in the radio, children's books and games, and the Stürmer newspaper, among others. But today, with social media, within a fraction of a second, it's possible to propagate different messages and rather unsavory messages very, very quickly. And just as an example, as we know, the American star Kanye West, who is now known as Ye West, he has an X account, and on that X account alone, he has approximately 30 million followers, which means within a fraction of a second, he can reach those people and propagate his some rather unsavory anti-Semitic beliefs. And if we compare that to the number of Jews in the world, where there are approximately 15 million, it's a difficult battle. It's not a very even keel here. And we are also, if we go full circle now to the beginning where we started about Mordechai Shenhabi at the beginning of memorializing the Holocaust, we are still very much entrenched in this trauma where this event hasn't finished. We are in a terrible war. The traumas are real. The scars are very open and sore right now. And the final piece, which is probably the most shocking of all, which this massacre happened on home soil. And it was believed that once the Jews had a state that they could call their own, these kind of events would never happen again. So this fact is contributes greatly to the trauma that happened. And just to finish off, if I had more time, I would discuss the more academic discussions that we have at Yad Vashem. And I'd love to forward you, to refer you to this amazing article by American novelist Dara Horn. She's a professor of literature, and she writes in The Atlantic in the May 2023 issue an incredible article about whether Holocaust education is making anti-Semitism worse. That sounds quite horrific, the thought of it, but really anti-Semitism is rife and rampant across the world. Now, she's writing this even before October the 7th, 2023. She basically, the bottom line, what she says is that we have to stop representing or teaching the Jews as victims, as portraying them as victims, that we have to show their very enriched culture and their longevity in the world, and talk more about their history and culture and customs, and perhaps they would be perceived more as equal human beings in society and not people to be victimized. But that's a lecture for another time. And just to finish off, if we look at if we read part of Elie Wiesel's speech at the opening of Yad Vashem, the second museum in Jerusalem 2025. He says this, it's quite long, but I think it's worth it. And so we go through the museum, and what should we do? Weep? No. My good friends, we never try to tell the tale to make people weep. It's too easy. We didn't want pity. If we decided to tell this tale, it is because we wanted the world to be a better world, just a better world, and learn and remember. There is a frightening character in all of Kafka's stories. It's always the messenger who tried to deliver the message and is unable to do so. We feel sorry for a poor messenger, but there is something more tragic than that, when the messenger has delivered the message and nothing has changed. You heard tonight those who spoke here with elegance, with compassion, and they spoke already about anti-Semitism and intolerance. Now, 60 years later, when the messenger has tried to deliver the message, why should there be anti-Semitism? But there is. Why should there be suicide killers? But there are. Why should there be hatred? But there is. Fanaticism? Yes. It is calmed? No, it's here. The messenger has delivered the message. What is our role? We must become the messengers. The messengers. This insistence that we have to keep telling this story, keep sharing this message until in the hope that it will get passed along. And just to finish off, as we approach Yom HaShoah here in Israel, which will start tomorrow evening, followed by a long day of memorial where all the cafes and places of entertainment will be closed for the day, and we will stand in 2 minutes of silence. The theme this year at Yad Vashem, we have one every year for Holocaust Remembrance Day 2025, is that of the anguish of liberation and the return to life. And here, when we focus on what these survivors went through when they came back after this shocking horrors horrors that they had experienced all those years. And this quote, again, we will always use the voice of the survivor or the victim themselves. This is Bela Brava, who was deported to Auschwitz and liberated from Czechoslovakia by the Red Army. And this is what he says. The camp guard who came to open the gate said, "You are free and you can leave." No one moved, no one went out. We didn't laugh, we were not happy, we were apathetic. And the Russians came. A general came in. He was Jewish. He told us that he was delighted to find that there were still people alive in the camp. He started to cry, but we didn't. He wept, and we didn't. And just from this quote alone, we might be able to understand the deep, vast complexities of this event, that all the different players, we don't focus on one story by itself. We look at it in the context of where this person was. We look at the liberators that are coming in and understanding that even some of the liberators themselves were Jewish, and what that must have been like for them to encounter all these horrors that they fell upon during this liberation process. And so we end up here on the last slide, this enormous area, 45 acres of Holocaust documentation, research, education, and memory that is Yad Vashem. This constantly changing, not changing, but developing by whatever is going on around us at the time, and taking into account the audiences across the world, the current affairs that are happening, and making sure that the voices of these victims and survivors are heard in their words specifically, and of course in the place of their people. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for your really most moving and insightful and profound presentation. Thank you for sharing the full presentation, because I know that it was a lot of information to share, and I think each slide was so worthwhile. And for reminding us to bring the stories of individuals to life, for sharing their names and their stories so poignantly and so sensitively. I think there are a lot of us here tonight who are Holocaust educators, volunteers, historians, people who are interested due to personal connections to the history. And just in your manner of presentation, you have reminded us on so many aspects of the way that we tell the story. And thank you so much for being a torchbearer ahead of Yom HaShoah, which starts tomorrow night and continues into Thursday, commemorating 80 years since the end of the war, almost, and as you mentioned, 82 years since the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We have a few minutes now for questions and answers with Sarah, so I invite you to please share any questions or comments that you may have in the chat or in the Q&A box below. Sarah, there are a lot of beautiful comments already in the chat, which we will share with you. Thank you, Glenn, for sharing your views on this very important aspect of October 7th memorialization and commemoration, and connecting it to the terminology that we use in the Holocaust to express our grief and our processing of that grief. Lots of people sharing that they really enjoyed your presentation and how eloquent you were. Thank you, Viv. Sarah, if you don't mind, I have a few questions as well that I'd like to ask that have come up. So you mentioned a lot about memorializing individuals and using the words of individuals to commemorate that history, and I think that is a beautiful approach and something that we are definitely should remember. How have your new developments at the center, the Touching Memories Theatre and the Value of the Community's audiovisual experience, how have those been approached, considering, you know, of course, most of our survivors are no longer with us, and in the Touching Memories Theatre, we have actors portraying the story of survivors or victims. What are some of the responses towards these new technologies and new ways of sharing the history?
Okay, thank you for the question. They're actually very new right now, and because sadly we're in a war, we don't have too many visitors right now, sadly. So we're waiting to hear. But of course, all the staff has attended these new things that we've kind of test driven them to find out, especially listening to the English translations from the actors as well. I feel it's a very beautiful and creative way to put it out there. It's very gentle. There's nothing dark and traumatic. There's much it's food for thought. They're about 45 minutes long, these theatrical performances by the brilliant actors. I mean, absolutely ingenious. And of course, they've done, the stories are told with great sensitivity and great creativity too. We're waiting, I'm actually running a seminar in June for 25 American professors. So I'm excited to hear their feedback on that, to see how they've viewed it. The audio visual hasn't actually begun yet. It's starting in a few weeks. So we wait to hear what people have to say about that. Again, we've all experienced it at Yad Vashem, and it's really truly magical to be amongst those Jerusalem stone walls of the Valley of the Communities, for those of you who've visited, and really to understand much more in depth about what these communities meant, these 5,000 communities that were wiped out during the Second World War.
Thank you so much. And we are really looking forward to hearing how that goes as well, especially as Israel's approaching summer and more visitors will come to the outdoor arena. There's a message from Zola, who's a descendant. Both of her parents were survivors from Lithuania, saying thank you so much to see what Yad Vashem is doing, and that Yad Vashem holds much of her family information. Hilda mentioning that the last march, the bas-relief sculpture shows total dejection and not resistance. And it was also something I noted while you were speaking, because growing up in a Jewish community environment, that was always the message, that these are the exact opposite of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Uprising, which shows the resistance of the fighters. When did that narrative shift?
Well, right then in the 1970s, exactly when Nathan Rappaport produced that piece. And as I mentioned, Professor Josef Bauer, who sadly passed away a few months ago, he created he came up with this new concept of, as I said, the Hebrew word amidah, of upstanding, of people who stood up. And it may not have been with the survivor Roman Kent said that resistance isn't only by a bullet and a gun. There are many ways to resist. And this is a message for all of us in any challenges that we face in life, that we have the power within us to, when we are in a difficult situation, and may we never be in a situation like these Jews went through in the Holocaust, but to somehow insist on maintaining their own dignity and maintaining their own identity as much as was possible at that time. And whether it was lighting candles on Hanukkah to remind them that it was a festival, whether it was even fasting in concentration camps where there was really no food at all for them, and yet for them to respect the day of Yom Kippur was another way of them kind of taking some control for themselves and maintaining who they were as Jewish people. So those stories for me are really remarkable. Again, that insistence, but that was very much a 1970s concept that came about, which is very much reflected in the last march by Nathan Rappaport.
Absolutely. And I think your talk does a beautiful job of showing how Holocaust remembrance and how we shape the narrative of history has changed over time, from silence to anger to sharing the story of survivors. And I have a question for you about the layout of the exhibition. So the exhibition, as you showed in your presentation, is a long passage from start to finish that cuts through the hill. But in your presentation, you also showed the different galleries. And can you tell us a little bit more about how it's designed so that visitors cannot just start at the beginning and go straight through the passage to the end?
Yeah, that's a great question. And had I had longer, I would have definitely discussed it more, but thank you for raising that now. So as you saw, there's a longer kind of a pyramid shape that cuts through the mountain. There are 9 galleries, and it literally goes through the history. But it begins with this beautiful 11-minute film, which is by the Israeli artist Michal Rovner, which shows the life before. And it's called Living Landscape. And she very ingeniously interweaves thousands of images and footage of life before, which is really quite brilliant, seeing as there were no smartphones at the time, where, you know, today people just video what breakfast they're eating. There wasn't that much available, but to see that richness. And this prism cuts through. You have to go through every memorial, and excuse the very bad analogy, but I always tell people that I guide that the museum is laid out like IKEA, that you have to go through every department before you get to the end. But the reason for that in Yad Vashem is because the Jews couldn't get from, the European Jewry couldn't get from one end to the other. In fact, 2/3 of them didn't get to the other side. And therefore we have to weave in through every gallery to understand how this built up. And another very important point that I always say when I'm guiding, in that very first gallery, which speaks about the Nazi rise to power, and we see some very difficult footage and friezes of Adolf Hitler and huge rallies with millions of people attending and chanting and supporting him. I always say that there's actually an incredible photo of a synagogue in Frankfurt, which is on fire during the November pogrom, the Kristallnacht of 9th and 10th of November, 1938. And for me, more poignant than the actual synagogue, this 100-year-old synagogue that's on fire, are the hundreds of people standing around watching it go up in flames. And I say to the people that I guide always, that had those people stood up and said something and demanded and demanded that this stopped, then there'd only be one gallery. There wouldn't be 9 galleries. The whole visit would be a 20-minute, I'll show you this crazy man came to power. He made all these terrible comments and insisting on certain very racial ideology, and had more people stood up at the time, they would have quashed him and kicked him out. But sadly, the message here is how easy it was in a supposedly highly cultured society for these people to be taken in by this really radical and murderous ideology. So yeah, but the 9 galleries as you come out at the exit, which I think for me is the most beautiful part of the museum, when you enter the triangle actually opens up onto a beautiful balcony which overlooks the Jerusalem forest, and you see this vast growth of trees and plants across, and you know, the city of Jerusalem ahead and other cities in the distance. And it's that hope. It's that although we've gone through this terrible journey as a people, we understand now that there's a future. We will take with us the memories and the lessons, and we will continue to build and to grow and to contribute to the world in many different ways. And for me, that literal breath of fresh air as you get out to the outdoors on that balcony, for me, is very heartwarming and hopeful.
Thank you. It really is a beautiful, beautiful space and well worth a visit for those who still intend to have the opportunity. We have a question in the Q&A. Yad Vashem memorializes the righteous among the nations, and we know that Yad Vashem has a vast area for that. Is there anything equivalent to honor those Jews who saved other Jews, even at the risk of their own lives?
That's an excellent question. I haven't got an amazing answer, but just to mention the righteous, we have 28,000 names of righteous among the nations, and there's a whole gallery about them. And of course, the first 2,000 of these 28,000 righteous had trees planted in their memory, and we would have continued planting these trees, except the roots of these trees rupture the stability of the mountain, so they had to stop planting trees. And the 26,000 subsequent names that we have there's a beautiful garden, and their names are placed on plaques on the wall, and they play a big role in the way that we tell the story of the Holocaust. But Jews saving Jews, there is in one of the galleries, yes, there is a section on that, but that's also part of our discussion, that should we be speaking about that more, because of course a Jewish person cannot be acknowledged or recognized as a righteous among the nations. They're one of the 5 categories, one of the 5 things that must be met in order to become a righteous is, in fact, that they must not be Jewish, just to prove that there was a truly altruistic gesture or act that they did. But yes, it's very interesting to talk about Jews saving Jews, and we definitely speak about that we should implement more of those stories into our teachings. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting question. And I think Yad Vashem, with the space that it does have, the 9 galleries, does an outstanding job of including things that most other museums don't have. So, for example, sections on North Africa and Western Europe, which our museum does not have the space to accommodate, or the stories of hidden children, and a whole section on the partisans. So I think these are all such important stories that are sometimes missed when we focus on the final solution only. And I think Yad Vashem does a beautiful job of incorporating. So, and you showed us so many memorials on your huge campus that focus on all these different aspects of the history. To finish off, I'd like to ask, what has your experience been since you've taken up your role at the international desk, teaching Holocaust memorial and education in the Southern Hemisphere? South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. I know that you've also been deeply involved with Echoes and Reflections in the States. I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to go back home to the UK to teach. Has it been a different experience to teaching in Israel?
Yes, absolutely. That's an amazing question. Well, first of all, it's my absolute privilege to be able to have the opportunity to visit the beautiful South Africa. It's just magnificent, the country in all its glory. And I've been to Australia a few times, and I was in New Zealand in January, actually. What I've been incredibly impressed with, especially in South Africa, you do this very well in your 3 Holocaust and genocide centers across Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg. I love the way you incorporate your own history and the way that's done. And I've quoted you in many of our department meetings, and they do the same in Australia. I was just literally there in January in the Melbourne Museum and the Sydney Museum, and they bring it's not one story here. We have this huge event, and everybody can contribute in a different way. So for example, in the Melbourne Museum, there's a huge survivor community there, and they play a very prevalent role in the Jewish community there, and of course in Holocaust education. For you in South Africa, I was really impressed the way you incorporated your own history and your own genocides, and the way you did that so sensitively. And I think it's really critical. But as I mentioned before, it's always important. We must make sure that we don't lose sight for each of these events, that we always focus on the victims themselves, in addition to bringing in, to contextualizing it rather. And I think you do that very, very well. And what we do in Israel, Yad Vashem in Israel, is to focus on the Jewish story, because that's who we are. And what you do in South Africa so well is to incorporate your own difficult histories that your nation has experience. So that for me is really, really interesting. Also to hear survivors from all the different countries that I've got to visit and their own different experiences. And what really makes my heart glow is to see how many amazing educators and museum guides there are, and how dedicated they are to this cause. And I tell them every time I travel that it just gives me a lot of hope to know that these messages aren't just being taught in Israel, but really across the board. And I can go to the other side of the world in New Zealand, and they are literally talking about and teaching about the Holocaust there, and the messages that we give. So that for me is very heartwarming.
Thank you so much. And we are so grateful to have you as a visitor in South Africa and as our contact person at Yad Vashem when we visit. It's been a real privilege chatting to you today, Sarah, and hearing your amazing insights and all the history and research that you've done and brought to our attention this evening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight from across the world. I know that Sarah has amazing contact and support from many, many different ports. If anyone would like to stay on the call to chat longer, you're very welcome. Otherwise, we have put Sarah's email in the chat for you to contact her further if you would like. I echo other participants in the chat saying a huge thank you to you, and we hope to have another webinar from you in due course, and wishing you all the best over Yom HaShoah and the upcoming Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut.
Thank you very
Good night,
much,
everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.